Green, if that's an option. I work off just my little laptop still, and that makes it a little hard sometimes. Okay, there it is. Um, you're just going to see like actual PowerPoint because I don't feel like making it into a presentation because I don't want this to be totally a presentation. All right. Sorry if you can hear Cat screaming in the background. We've started moving and he's having a hard time with it. So during a previous call today that some of you were also on for Shelby, he was climbing all over me and now he's taken to just sitting outside the door. Anyway, my name's Hannah Buckland. I didn't put my actual job title on here, the Digital Equity Program Lead with the Minnesota Office of Broadband Development. We're a state office that is part of our State Department of Employment and Economic Development. But I'm a librarian. There I am dressed as Dumbledore when I was 17 at the local public library where I got my start, and that's my younger sister dressed as the fat lady in her portrait. Um, so worked at libraries for a while. While I was at Leech Lake Tribal College in the library there, I was appointed as a member of our former governor's task force on broadband. So that's what ended up leading me into this current position where I focus on administering Digital Equity Act stuff for Minnesota. Um, this group is fun because you're library people, first of all, which is great. I'm instantly happy because of that. And then also, you're pretty familiar with a lot of these. As I monologue through some of this, please interrupt me as desired, whether in the chat or um, unmuting yourself. I can kind of see the chat. So we'll see how that goes. But you're all familiar with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, or Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or whatever it's being called at the moment. Signed into law in November of 2021. So it just celebrated its third birthday somehow. I don't know if you all remember where you were on November 15th, 2021, but I do. And I did not think we would still be slogging through this in the way that we are. I thought we might be farther along, but that's okay. Within IIJA, there were four broadband related programs. The two we'll take a closer look at are Broadband Equity Access and Deployment and also Digital Equity Act. So you mentioned BEAD earlier in the updates. We know that states and territories, it's $42.45 billion. So I tell people that anytime you see a headline about federal broadband stuff, it is probably not my job. It is probably BEAD. BEAD has four priority areas that states are required to address in the order they're listed here. So first, locations that lack access to broadband at speeds of 25 megabits per second download and 3 megabits per second upload. Then locations that lack access to 120. After that, it's community anchor institutions that lack gigabit connections. States were given some liberty in defining what a community anchor is for them. So there's some variation from state to state about what is a community anchor and what is not. But public libraries and schools, healthcare facilities are generally anchor institutions. And then last on the list is digital equity activities. So if a state can connect every location to 120 and every community anchor institution to gigabit service, they can do digital equity activities with whatever is remaining. These are also sometimes called non-deployment funds. Looking at an article from the Benton Foundation from March, this is the short list of states that expressed some degree of optimism in their BEAD plan regarding their likelihood of achieving those three priorities and maybe having funding left over for non-deployment. I know there are a few digital equity state folk on this call, so please jump in if you see something incorrect or if you want to elaborate on something I have listed here. So if you're in one of these states, though, there's a chance that there might be some non-deployment funds available to support digital equity activities in library spaces or just in a broader sense than just internet service being deployed. If your state is not on this list, you are probably geographically large. You are probably a state that has a lot of rocks, and your state will be focused pretty much entirely on just getting internet service deployed. Minnesota's in that group of large states in the southwest corner has a lot of rocks. So this is something you can do for BEAD. A lot of this work is about waiting and waiting and waiting indefinitely. But these are things you actually can do now if you so choose, or later in the month when it's the end of the month and you need something to fill your time. I recommend contacting your state broadband office and or your state's BEAD federal program officer to introduce yourself, to say, hey, our library is interested in being part of this work, especially if you saw your state on that list of states that might possibly have non-deployment funds available. These are the kinds of questions you would want to ask, like, if we're lacking a gigabit connection, can we expect to receive that? We do have a library in Minnesota that has no internet service whatsoever, so they are on that list now. Does the state anticipate having BEAD funds that are available for non-deployment at all? And then how can libraries support or participate in non-deployment activities? And I see Chelsea has put in the chat that Idaho is seeing that it's unlikely to be able to use non-deployment funding. And, like with the amount of time it's taken to roll these programs out, plans that were made, a year ago, costs to deploy that actual infrastructure have increased, but the amount of funding states receive will not increase. So we can expect that this little list is probably going to shrink over time. I was also wondering how Idaho is going to achieve that with all those rocks and all that space. The next program that you all know and love is the Digital Equity Act. This is also known as the reason I grind my teeth at night. There are 3 funding categories. We have planning grants, capacity grants, competitive grants. Right now, we are in a state of turmoil, I would say, between capacity grants and competitive grants and what comes next. And no one quite knows. Some states know. We're not one of them, unfortunately. With the planning grants, y'all remember these. It was the awards for states, tribes, or states and territories to create state-specific digital equity plans. If for whatever reason you haven't visited your state's plan yet, there's a nonprofit called World Education that provides a really nice Google Doc that outlines all of the state plans, all of the contacts for each state's digital equity grant. So this can be a good place to find information. With all of those plans, we looked at covered populations. There are 8 of them, and they are listed here, and they probably look very familiar to many of you. The groups of people who are historically left behind when it comes to digital access. And of course, people don't fall neatly into any one of these categories. People are complicated and people are full beings. People don't just check a single box and live their life in the same way as everyone else who checks that single box. So we understand that even as NTIA is pushing us to focus on covered populations as isolated entities in some cases, that it's never going to be that easy, and that there's like value in it being messy too, because that means it's real. We'll look at the capacity grants now. I tried to include some like behind the scenes chaos here for you all because I feel like NTIA, well, I know NTIA doesn't share that ever. And I think it's helpful in like understanding why things are taking so long or just all of that, why your state has kind of fallen off the face of the earth, perhaps. So with these capacity grants, these are those non-competitive formula grants for states to implement the activities they identified in their plans. In Minnesota, our first digital equity grant is going to be about $12 million. The next one will be about 6 million, and then the last one will be about 6 million. So it's kind of a dizzying reality where states will be applying annually for 3 years for this funding. Each period of performance is 5 years. So there's a lot of juggling in the background of like, how do we do this? How do you constantly apply for grants and report on the same grants and run the program? I have yet to figure that out. With the state capacity grants, there are some caps in place. One that I like to call out is that internet affordability cap at 10%. So Minnesota, with our first installment, can't spend more than 1.2 million on internet affordability programs. The moment that ACP disappeared, my inbox filled with things from well-intending Minnesotans saying, hey, are you going to use your capacity grant to fill this? And we very quickly showed that 1.2 million is legally the amount we could use, and that would last about 10 days to cover Minnesota's ACP usage as it was during the highest month of participation. This is a list of states at the bottom that NTIA has put out press releases about them being approved. And I might have missed some because it's hard to find them, but it's approved is in quotes because approved falls on a spectrum, we have learned. There is not just approved and not approved. There is a whole range of what states are experiencing when these press releases go out, which is just wild to me. It's very nice to be congratulated on something that is like totally not done and also could have been announced 3 months ago, but that's okay. I wanted to show you step by step what it's looking like in Minnesota, just to like get that clarity. Noting that every state is obviously a different state, and every state is seeing this timeline roll out differently ultimately. So in Minnesota, that capacity grant application, which was due on May 28th, we submitted it May 24th. So that's now 6 months and 2 days. In mid-July, NTIA contacted us and had a couple concerns with our application that we somehow addressed very quickly. I feel like they didn't read it thoroughly for some reason. They saved that for other states. And then at the end of July, NTIA forwarded Minnesota's application to an entity known as NIST, which is best said with narrowed eyes and kind of like a hiss. NIST is also part of the Department of Commerce, along with NTIA. NTIA and NIST work together on these grants in that NTIA is kind of directing the programmatic aspects, whereas NIST is looking at the financial side. So NIST isn't going to come back and say something like, this program doesn't make sense. Instead, they're going to come back and say things to states like, you entered the number 85.7 when you should have entered the number 87.5. You have 3 days to fix this and resubmit. And so this is where a lot of states are seeing the process drag out because we're correcting budgets in the extreme detailed versions of them. So for Minnesota, this took the better part of 3 months to get it all corrected. It was details like this number is wrong by 0.012. Please fix and resubmit. The information included in this cell of the spreadsheet should also be copied into the cell directly below it. Please do that and resubmit. They're very thorough. I appreciate it. And also I hate it. So October 30th then is the date that NTIA announced Minnesota's capacity grant award was approved, although technically this approval happened July 27th when it went to NIST. And at the same time, this approval does not mean we actually have the money. A state doesn't actually have any control over the funds within its capacity grant until it's signed what is called a CD 450, which is a federal form, the form that says it's yours, go. Minnesota's is 31 pages long. So our attorneys at the state are looking through that now. We received the draft of it on November 15th. Once it's signed, we'll have an award start date. And then the, the next hurdle for a lot of states is going to be this thing called the specific projects form. And we're just going to talk through that a little. It's the most boring thing you can imagine, but it's 34 columns of a spreadsheet. States need to fill out details for every intended grant recipient, and then NIST and NTIA review and approve those. States have 9 months from the start of their grant period to fill out this form that is outlining all of their grants that they intend to make for that 5-year grant period, which, if it sounds mind-boggling and illogical, it kind of is mind-boggling and illogical. This is usually the part where my brain just shuts down because I can't think that far into the future now. A loophole that has availed itself that some of us are relying on is that states are able to award grants to like an intermediary, so maybe a state library or a state library association, and then that intermediary can be the one to subaward smaller grants like to individual libraries. So in that case, an organization receiving funds directly from the state would be the only thing that that state has to include on the specific projects form. This complicates it in some ways. Well, it's all complicated. But when you're thinking about like, where would I go to find information about what grant opportunities are available? It might not be your state's broadband office if your state is redirecting funds to other organizations to subgrant from there. So there's this added layer that I think a lot of states might be relying on in order to make that 9-month specific project window functional for a 5-year grant period. Any questions about that? Any discussion? Yes, in some cases it will be easier because like your state library is closely involved or is leading the charge. That's true. So something you can do is contact your state broadband office or your state's digital equity federal program officer. NTIA used to just have one program officer per state, and they changed it up this fall, and now every state has a program officer for BEAD and then a different program officer for digital equity stuff. And you can find those contacts either on NTIA's website for the FPOs and then back in that World Education list for the state broadband office contacts. And these are some questions to ask your state broadband office. Are you okay? And have you had any water today? And as I typed that out earlier, I was like, wait, no, I have not, but now I have. Um, it'll be a useful question to ask, like, how are you approaching that specific projects form? Do they plan to have some kind of intermediary that you would interact with instead of the state broadband office? Or is the library going to be able to apply immediately in that first go round? And when does the state anticipate having capacity funds available? There's never a quick answer to this, but there's a long babbling answer. And then how can libraries support or participate in the grant activities? It's also helpful to familiarize yourself with your state's plan. I know some of you worked on yours or even wrote yours. But if libraries are absent, you can ask, how are they going to be included? States are allowed to revise their plans as often as needed. So if libraries are really, really absent from your state's plan, you can push to have that changed. It's not impossible at all. It's quite feasible. Just a couple more grant programs to talk through. The one that's open right now is the Native Entity Digital Equity Capacity Grant Program. This is for Native entities like federally recognized tribes, Alaska Native corporations. This one has a really, really long application window. So it opened in September and closes February 7th. The awards are up to $2 million, no cost share required. And we learned a Native entity that receives this funding can also receive state capacity funding. So a tribal library would be a great applicant for this program working with their tribe. And as a former tribal librarian, I'd like to include that. So with this, you contact your tribe, make sure they're familiar with the program. You know, if tribes are often staffed by a small handful of very, very busy people that receive tons of grants notifications daily. And so raising this to someone's awareness can be what it takes to get it noticed. How can a tribal library or a public library that's adjacent to a Native nation support an application in this way? With the Native entity capacity grants, they have two options. They can either request planning funding and capacity funding, or they can just request capacity funding. So the other little question is, are you requesting the planning funding? Because that would be a great opportunity too for a library to start supporting a tribe in their digital equity work by starting with that planning process. Almost through with these. Last is the competitive grants. We've all heard about those. $1.25 billion, over 700 applications. I have no insider information about what to expect with these. If anyone else does, you're welcome to share. This is something we've seen happening throughout this, is some squishiness with timelines. Initially, from the state perspective, we were thinking we'll do this plan, we'll get our capacity grant, we'll get that started, and then these competitive grants will enter the scene, and the competitive grants will respond to gaps that they see in capacity grants. But because those capacity grants have gotten delayed and the competitive grants have moved forward, we're starting to see it shift from competitive grants filling state gaps to a situation where states are probably going to have to fill some competitive grant gaps. So, a competitive grant for a state might cover something that the state was intending to do. The state will then have to pivot so that funding is being used appropriately. I want to take a moment to look at the chat because I'm seeing lengthy things. Yes, burning the candle at both ends. Yes. Okay. So this point being made about one time that worked for everyone resonates deeply, especially with, you also have the chaos of the BEAD program happening at these offices. And in many states, this is only like the second or third year that they've had a state broadband office. So you might have people who are new to state government. In Minnesota, ours has been around since 2013, which is advantageous in that like we exist already. But it's also complicated in that like we already have 3 other state programs that we're also administering. And I see a question too. Do you think that state libraries that have not yet had discussions with their broadband office about their position as a potential subgrantee is likely not being considered? We've had trouble in our state having more detailed conversations about this during limbo time. I mean, personally, I don't think that just because that discussion hasn't been had, it won't be possible. I know I've been told to kind of keep our cards close and not have detailed conversations about what to expect because we don't know what to expect. We have a sense of a timeline, but it's so vague right now that it's hard to give a precise timeline to either our state library or any library approaching us, and be able to stand by that. So we try to at least be transparent about that anyway. But I recommend continuing to reach out to whoever it is in your state that's holding that money. Wanted to address the future real quick too, because the future is all kinds of strange and unknowable. So like largely we don't know what happens next. Um, we had our state broadband task force meeting today, and someone asked about like what's going to happen when this new administration takes over, and the very convenient and like kind of sanitized answer my boss gave is like, we were hired to do these jobs, we will continue to do these jobs, we will continue to do these jobs to the best of our ability, whatever that looks like. um, in interacting with all of the other folks who are in this position administering state digital equity funds, there's a lot of passion and a lot of care for this work. I know layers of bureaucracy can obscure that quite a lot. Um, but at that state level, there are a lot of good people pushing hard to get this work started and get it done and do it in the way that it was intended. Um, I also wanted to address, well, I put in the link or in the chat a link to a letter by a senator that outlines some of the directions things could go in the future. Um, and I think it's, speculation and planning are important. And at the same time, like this work just, it has to happen. It has to be done. So for every minute I spend fretting and speculating, there's also got to be some like keep moving forward to that as well. And one of the conversations that we're seeing come up quite suddenly is about the word equity itself. Some states are shifting from equity to opportunity or equity to access. Um, in Minnesota, I was adamant from the onset that we would use the word equity. Like, we're not changing it. It will be equity. That's what it is. I know that term can be politicized, but also I just wasn't having it. Um, and then as we formed our plan, we heard from a lot of people who contributed to our plan that the word equity was tripping them up, that it felt like jargon, that it felt like, federal legal blather, and that it didn't really have the meaning that it has from this perspective. We also learned that it didn't translate, that phrase digital equity didn't translate well from English into other languages. So we ended up switching to opportunity because of that. So you can, expect some concern around language, and at the same time, like, yes, words matter, and also the work that is going to be done is going to be done regardless. It's 3:45. I'm curious. I'm going to stop sharing, but I'll make sure these slides are somehow available. How's it going in your states? I see in the chat that Arlene expected to see a NOFO from the office itself, and is now wondering if they are going to even issue a general NOFO or you leave that up to subgrantees. It's so hard to know on a state by state basis because we really are all at it differently. What state are you in?
I'm in Oregon, and I think
Oh, yeah.
another thing that is maybe a little bit different about what's going on in Oregon is a lot of the work associated with the application and the plan and stuff is being done by a contractor for the
Yeah.
broadband office. And I do wonder if that has kind of created some of these communication issues, I think, where, we're told that, well, we're waiting on the feds to get everything worked out. But as I've been listening here, it feels like there's still work that can be done to bring together groups and to talk about potential projects without having everything in place on the NTIA level. And so I guess that's where I'm feeling a little behind the eight ball compared to what I've heard is going on in other states. So I'm just really curious about that.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I think here's the cat. Anyone from Minnesota would probably say something similar, minus the contractor part. One of the challenges some of us are seeing is that when our planning grant funding ended, we started being paid out of other pots of funding. So like right now I am technically BEAD staff. And so there's some challenges around like actually doing digital equity work when I'm supposed to be doing like the BEAD audit materials, and that sort of thing. But if a state has a contractor specifically for digital equity, I would hope that they could, you know, do a little more in that area. Erin's all by herself too. I see you. Yeah.
I'm general fund though, so I can still talk to whoever I want right now.
Oh,
It's fantastic. I mean, my organization hates that I'm general fund, but at least I'm not being paid out of bead and like,
yeah,
that's rough.
right. Yeah. Yeah. And they do ask for justification on that, we learned. So I had to just have to make sure I include bead in everything that I do in some way. See Maine's in good shape with their connectivity authority. Maine does impress me with their work.
And if it's okay, I just wanted to go back to your comment, Arlene. It's, here in Arizona, we're doing a mixture of those things. So like we'll still have a NOFO. So just to highlight that again, like every state is going to be different. And, there's no one size and there's no guessing unless your people have said it, and I've tried to be as transparent as I can be in the conversations that I've had here in Arizona, but it's still hard for the potential applicant to know what to do, right? But like some of our state agencies that we are planning to work directly with, I have a different type of conversation with them than I do with a nonprofit or whoever that might be directly trying to serve. So if they're not saying no I wouldn't be concerned that you won't see one, I guess is where my mind would go with that.
Has anyone had any like incredible successes in reaching out to a state for information? Swat the cat off my chair. Happy to just sit here quietly. That's where I am today.
Thank you, Hannah, for being here.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any other questions or just comments about what's going on with the capacity grants or what you're working on?
I have just another question related to this, like the transparency piece. I mean, Hannah, what you shared today is so helpful for me to understand what is actually going on in my broadband office when it comes to its interaction with NTIA and all of the other groups involved in this. So I wonder, I mean, I think the thing that I think we're very confused by is, you know, is NTIA encouraging broadband offices not to discuss process with communities, or is this just something that each state is experiencing based on the politics or the configurations of their own broadband offices? Because I do think that we've lost organizations that were interested in this funding because they can't get any information about stuff. And so I'm just curious if, I mean, I don't want to assign blame because I think it's a very complicated thing and I think it's just hard, but I also want to see if there are things that I can do to help with, you know, recruiting organizations back to this because I'm not the person in charge of it and that kind of thing. So I'm just trying to think of ways that we can give some of the organizations that I really do think are going to be the ones that expand our capacity some hope that this program is actually going to materialize into something that will be useful to the organization.
Any other states are welcome to jump in on this, but I think the pressure to not be transparent and to like keep things close for us comes from the state level. You know, and on one hand, NTIA is not transparent with us.
Yeah.
A lot of this is just like talking to other states and seeing what else people are experiencing and kind of piecing it together from there. And then, you know, in Minnesota, when our governor showed up on the presidential ballot, the information that we were allowed to share immediately changed. You know, whether it's in writing or it's spoken, immediately changed. So it's a position where like I think it ultimately comes down to relationships. You know, I can't put in our newsletter that update that I just gave you. Um, but I can sit down with a prospective grantee and say like, listen, this is what's going on. But if you're in a position too, where like you are trying to connect with a contractor or your state broadband office isn't responding, I can see how that relationship component and that trust is just not there. And that seems to be like the current medium for any sort of useful communication. Yeah. Other state people, your thoughts?
I would just say there's a level this is not maybe the best way to say this, but we're scared something will change and it'll come back on us, you know? Not that it's happened in a detrimental way or anything like that, but it's not in our control as much as we want it to be, and that it's it's advertised to be more in control of the states, I think, than it truly is. And I know, you know, I've had conversations where it's like, what is actually in our plan anymore? Because it changes, you know, and like you have to change this one thing. Well, did it get changed everywhere? You know, and which version is somebody looking at and all of that kind of thing. And it's just, you know, you don't want to get caught in what looks like a lie, even if it's not a lie. And to Hannah's point, you know, I will have a different conversation with somebody that I know isn't going to come back and like, you know, say, oh, well, last week you said this. Well, yeah, but last week was, you know, last week, right? Like things change. And for what it's worth, I don't think anyone's trying to be like secretive or anything. It's just like things change and we don't want to break down a relationship based on something that changed and it was out of our hands.
I'll jump on too from Idaho since we have our subgrants open too. And so some of the information and stuff that we've been sharing, like I don't know what's going to be in those interim reports, right? That we have to submit back to NTIA. And that's information that our subgrantees are going to have to collect because we're subgranting like 80% of our award out the door, right? And so been trying to open those subgrants and let people know what they're going to have to report on. And I don't know what they're going to have to report on. I know the bare bones that is in the notice of funding opportunity, but how you interpret that has been up to a lot of arguments back and forth between states and NTIA for all of that. And so we've been relying on disclaimers a lot. It's like, this is the information I have at this point, but I can't control how it works between federal agencies. And so we're just requesting that folks are patient with us as we go through this. It's like Hannah said, we've got NTIA, we also have NIST, and there's going to be a few other federal agencies that have to review those specific projects forms. So as we're coordinating between multiple federal agencies, we're kind of the monkey in the middle that's getting pulled in multiple directions. And I think I don't want to speak for your state, but I will say for us, we're trying to do the best that we can to get this money out the door, and we know that it's so important. And we want it out the door, but it's been a bit of a balancing act with all of the federal requirements that are in these grant programs. So
I guess I'll just observe that just in general, digital equity work or digital opportunity work or whatever you want to call it is about relationship building ultimately. And I think that the work cannot be done productively unless that is at the root, I think, of a lot of program development and that kind of thing. And so and maybe it's just, the nature of, how a federal program that's seeking to serve such a wide group of people makes a program that is at its root still about one-on-one relationships with people. And maybe that's really ultimately where that challenge is. And so, yeah, I just been thinking a lot about, what are we doing to help make this better for the organizations and the people who we really want to serve and keep them away from the mess and get them to a point where they're actually still, excited about doing the work.
Yeah, I
So,
agree with that strongly, and I appreciate how you articulated that. Like with some of the early relationships that our office built with prospective grantees, like I genuinely feel protective of them and like don't want them to get the wrong information or, something like that because it's that relationship component and that's not necessarily scalable in a way that
mhm.
we would want it to be. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, we're just about at time here. Hannah, thank you so much. Nate, I think, said in the chat that was super clear. So yeah, thank you. If you are able to share your slides and connect, I think that would be great. We also recorded, so we'll have the recording available on YouTube. But yeah, thanks for being here, Hannah. Thanks everyone else for being here and participating in the conversation. It's just really great to hear how everyone's thinking about the work and where the different states are. So that's awesome. Happy holidays, everyone. I dropped the link for the survey again in the chat. Please take a few minutes to do that so we can be prepared for these meetings next year. But yeah, happy holidays. Please stay in touch. And if anybody needs to chat, we'll leave the line open for another minute. But otherwise, have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.